Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's Schiller Institute International webcast featuring our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This has been another week of extremely fast-paced developments from the Swiss Alps to the Pacific region to Latin America, and I think it's crucial that we evaluate where we stand now with the State of the Union address coming up in the United States next week and President Trump speaking in Davos tomorrow. Helga, there were some very strong financial warnings at Davos, even while the global elite seemed to be celebrating this fake news of a great economic global recovery. What's the real story?
Well, the former chief economist of the Bank of International Settlement, William White, who is now in a leading position in the OECD, gave a very interesting interview to Ambrose Evans-Pritchard from the Daily Telegraph, warning that the next financial crash is inevitable. Now, I think this is absolutely so. We have said it many times, but it's good to hear it from at least one prominent economist. And he blames the policy of the quantitative easing for that coming crash, by basically saying that this policy of pumping money has created catch-22 because the central banks really cannot forever continue with the zero interest rate policy and the quantitative easing, because there are already now very clear global inflation pressures. But and that makes the bubble just bigger. And when it finally explodes, the longer you wait, the worse it becomes. But on the other side, if they would want to end that, which they want to or would want to, even the slightest increase in the interest rate could trigger a crash. And he pointed to the fact that there are many fracture points in the global financial system. And he then said, basically, it's inevitable. Now, that is obviously a subject which is so grave that it would deserve full attention at the Davos meeting, because you have there somewhere 2,500 to 3,000 top bankers, government officials, CEOs, and you would think that that is the area where you would come up with solutions. But the speeches made so far, with the one exception of the Chinese representative Liu He, who is a key advisor to President Xi Jinping and a new member of the Politburo. He is said to be probably the most influential advisor of Xi Jinping concerning the structural reforms inside China. He made a decent speech warning of the problems in the financial system. But all the others, like Merkel and Modi and Macron, I mean, they said various things, but nothing to address really this fundamental question. So I think, in German, there is a proverb which says, außer Spesen nichts gewesen. I don't know if this exists in English. It means other than a lot of bills being made, nothing much comes out of this Davos meeting. So I think the problems really remain. And unless Trump, who is supposed to speak tomorrow, makes a miracle speech, which I don't think is to be expected, really, this meeting will have taken place without solving the urgent financial crisis. And just to add the insanity of this, while the Chinese economy is the only sound one, it's unbelievably efficient, it's quick, it's modern, it's moving with a speed, it's pulling other countries into the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's the only sound, real economic dynamic on the planet. But then you have such so-called economists like Professor Kenneth Rogoff from Harvard, who basically says, yes, the next financial crisis will be centered in China, and China will be the trigger point. Nothing is more wrong than that, and it just shows you, the blame game is on, but the willingness to really go to the root of the problem, which would require Glass-Steagall and the whole Hamiltonian banking, what we have been organizing for, this is not happening.
And one of the points William White has been making is that you have a number of these zombie companies that have been staying afloat because of the low interest rates or the zero interest rates, that they need all the liquidity they can get to cover their interest on their debt. And that's part of the unsustainability. And we're seeing some of these companies blow out, like Carillion in Britain, which could lead to 50,000 layoffs. Now, Helga, the other thing that I think characterizes the urgency of the strategic situation is the report that Robert Mueller, the legal assassin, is moving to try to get some kind of obstruction of justice charges. Clearly a defensive reaction to the explosion of evidence of the corruption of his own staff. What's the latest you have on that?
Oh, this is becoming really a very, very interesting story. There is one author whose name I have just forgotten, but he compared the imploding Russiagate with a Russian doll, these multi-layered dolls. And he says, this Russiagate story is like, you open one doll and there's another doll, and in the center, there is absolutely nothing. And I think this is really coming now out. It's backfiring. Senator Grassley and Lindsey Graham, surprisingly enough, they are now demanding from the FBI and the Department of Justice that they open up a criminal investigation, the Department of Justice, that is against Christopher Steele, saying that there are many inconsistencies, what he was saying at different locations. And, also there is now a big demand to come to the bottom of what happened to these 50,000 emails, which just miraculously got lost. I mean, this is incredible. These were emails exchanged between Peter Strzok from the FBI and his girlfriend, Lisa Page, and they are covering the period between December 2016 and May 2017. Now, to have 50,000 emails lost, and as William Binney, the former high-ranking NSA member, he pointed out to the fact that this is virtually impossible because there were the same records by the FBI and also the NSA. They had exactly the same emails, and to make them simultaneously disappear would not only require a willful action, but it would also mean you would have to toss some hardware. So Senator Grassley has said that he will do everything in his power to retrieve this, to somehow find a technical way to retrieving these emails. And, this is really Watergate. The cover-up was worse than the initial crime. And, you have now a situation where the emails which did make it into the hands of the investigating committees in the Congress, the oversight committees, and there it is now clear that Strzok and his girlfriend talked about a secret society which met repeatedly to discuss the plot, how to prevent the election campaign of Trump, and then after he did win the election, how to get him out of the White House. Now, there's another senator who says that he has an independent informant who confirmed that such meetings of a secret society to plot against Trump did take place. And this is all now coming out, and it can really lead, as now many congressmen have said, Republican congressmen, it will lead not only to firing some of these people, but in all likelihood to a criminal pursuit.
Emphasize the importance of the British role in this. And around Christopher Steele, this is beginning to emerge. But what do you think the congressman should be looking at in order to get really at the bottom of what initiated this, who initiated it, and why?
Well, I mean, the initial reports came from British intelligence, and the fact that Christopher Steele supposedly is a former MI6 agent, I think that is also worth to look into, because this dossier, this was probably outsourced to the British intelligence, or, the cooperation between the Obama administration and British intelligence. I mean, that is an area, which some people have mentioned the word treason, and I think this is exactly what it amounts to. I mean, this is the biggest scandal in my view, bigger than Watergate, and probably the biggest scandal maybe since the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the cover-up of that. In any case, I think it is something which will not go away, and there is no way how an investigation of Trump, which Mueller is now trying to do, and Trump already said he will agree with it, I don't think that will derail this other scandal one bit.
And I think the other side of the British question is we go back in the dossier that we provided on Mueller's history, that the initial investigation of your husband by the FBI was initiated also by British intelligence. The other issue of the British is the shift, or not the shift, but the escalation by the NeoCons for confrontation with Russia and China. And we see that developing through a series of memos coming out, discussion papers. The Russians are responding very sharply, as are the Chinese now. So catch us up on where that stands.
Well, there is this really terrible new military doctrine, national security paper, which basically calls Russia and China the worst security problem of the United States, worse than terrorism, and uses really a very Cold War kind of language. Now, that has all kinds of implications. I find it quite interesting that some of the Chinese and also Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, reacted very, very strongly. I think we mentioned that already last week, that Lavrov made a very clear distinction between Trump's intention and what his opposition forces him to do, because he is looking at the Senate, where he can expect that all his vetoes on policy would be overruled. Now, it is quite noteworthy that the Chinese ambassador in Washington, Cui Tiankai, just made a statement re-emphasizing that from China's standpoint, the relationship between the United States and China is one of partners, and that this partnership is absolutely key to solve all crucial problems in the world. So I think it's really good that China is not responding in the same language. And in a terrible contrast to that, there was a press conference in Berlin, federal press conference, and a journalist asked the government spokesperson, what is the German attitude to this new security paper? And the spokesperson said, we naturally, for us, the United States is the most important ally, and we fully back up everything they do. I mean, it was just totally outrageous, as if there would be no interest for Germany to avoid a conflict between the United States and Russia. And it just shows you that this country, at least concerning its official representatives, is still completely occupied. At least in the mind of this spokesperson, you could see the occupying forces clearly coming out of her mouth. It's terrible.
Well, and even while we're seeing these kinds of security statements, defense documents, and so on coming out, the president is still insisting that he wants good relations with Russia and China.
Oh yeah, I think that the Trump is absolutely still intending what he promised in the election campaign, but he is really surrounded by a lot of NeoCons in the Republican Party, and actually the Democrats are really the war party. I mean, they are obsessed with this Russiagate, and they are driving the confrontation continuously. So, I mean, Trump really has a very difficult time.
The leading confrontation areas, which is developing in a very dangerous way, is Ukraine. What's going on there with the Ukraine situation?
Well, that could easily become the number one conflict and hotspot on the planet, because the radar, which, as people probably remember, has a lot of Nazis as parliamentarians sitting in it, they made a new law which basically calls to retake the Donbass, which is the pro-Russian part of eastern Ukraine, take that back by military means, and by implication also the Crimea. Poroshenko has not yet signed this law, but they already have built up a military headquarter in order to prepare such a military action. And that could very, very clearly lead to a war between Russia and NATO. I mean, this is a very dangerous development. And, it's a complete scandal. There was now a report that a Texas military weapons firm has delivered heavy weapons and I think also tanks, if I'm not mistaken, to the Azov battalion. And on the website of the Azov battalion, you can actually see that they are using this exact grenade launchers, which the United States gave them, and US military personnel is training them. Now, that same report also mentions that the Azov battalion is training right-wing extremists from all over Europe in the use of heavy weapons, the driving of tanks. And I remember that President Putin quite a while ago warned that if the Nazi coup in Ukraine would not be neutralized, that there would be the danger of fascism coming all over Europe from that. And I think that if these right-wing military type of training is taking place, I think this should be really subject of an investigation. I think there was in the Congress of the United States a while ago some congressmen which demanded that there should be absolutely no military cooperation with the Azov battalion. And it would be very good if these congressmen would start to investigate this present scandal right away.
And the same networks that helped to organize the neo-Nazi coup in Kiev that overthrew a democratically elected president, these are the same networks behind the aggressive language against China and Russia, National Endowment for Democracy, and so on. So they're still very prominent.
Yes, I think that we absolutely need to publish this, and people have to be really aware that the war danger is extremely acute. I can only remind people again of what the former Secretary of Defense William Perry had said in respect to the Hawaii so-called false alarm, where he pointed to the fact that we are minutes away because all the nuclear arsenals are on launch on warning. So I think a change of this policy is really urgently required.
In contrast to this war talk, we're seeing interesting developments from Japan and also between North and South Korea. You mentioned this before when we were talking. What's going on with President or Prime Minister Abe in Japan?
Well, that is one of the more enjoyable developments, because Japan used to be closely allied with the United States, no matter what administration there was. And while Abe is still a friend of Trump, and he said that repeatedly, he is also pointing out again and again the absolute crucial cooperation between Japan and Russia, the fact that they're working very well together in the development of the Northern Islands, and that will be the basis for a peace treaty between Russia and Japan. And Abe wants to have such a peace treaty while he is still in office, so that is in the foreseeable future. And he also repeatedly stressed that Japan is now fully cooperating with the AIIB and the Belt and Road Initiative of China. So here you have a case, of a statesman who, really changed, to the better from a rather confrontation line towards China and Russia, while maintaining a good relationship with Trump. After all, he visited him. I think one of the earliest foreign leaders who visited with Trump was Abe. But at the same time, he also is stressing the absolute need to cooperate with Russia and China. And I just would wish that some of the European leaders would, follow in his footsteps and do exactly that, because that would then create a completely different dynamic, which also would impact the warmongers in the United States, because it would point them out to be more isolated, rather than slavishly following whatever stupidity comes out of certain circles, pushing confrontation.
Abe also announced that he's going to go to South Korea for the Winter Games, the Winter Olympics. What do you make of the developments in the last week between North and South Korea?
Well, that is actually also one of the better points of development. Interestingly, not reported much by the mainstream media, which were very happy to report when things went bad. So what happened was that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, in his New Year's address, had called on all Korean people for a peaceful reunification of the two Koreas. And he repeatedly said that they should not give in to challenges coming in the way of such an effort for reunification. Now, the North Korean delegation of sports people and also music people has arrived in Seoul, and there will be a big pop star from North Korea and pop music orchestra, and they will play. And then there is a joint ice hockey women's team. North and South Korean women will play hockey together in one team. So I think this is all very good. And after all, President Moon of South Korea had thanked Trump that his efforts had made this possible, and he did not refer to the sometimes hawkish statements by Trump, but I think he pointed to the fact that there were absolutely crucial back-channel discussions between the United States and North Korea, and also Russia and China and North Korea. So this seems to be on a good way, and hopefully, the fact that Abe will be there, I think this will all. This is one of the spots where dialogue is showing clear superiority to confrontation.
And in the background of this, you have the continuing momentum around the Belt and Road Initiative. I want to point out to our viewers that there was another article written about your intervention and your support for the Belt and Road and your active involvement that people can see on the Schiller Institute website. But we have this conference report from CELAC, the Central American and Caribbean nations, where a top Chinese official was just there talking about the Belt and Road, and to great acclaim from the leaders there. What's happening with this?
Well, CELAC, which is obviously the Caribbean and Latin American country organization, is now officially working with the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And this obviously has boosted the mood in all of the Caribbean, in Central American, Latin American countries, that there is a real perspective to do exactly what Africa is doing. So you have two continents, which, in our past decades of efforts for a new world economic order, I always used to compare Africa and Latin America, because, many years ago, when you would look at the map of these two continents, in the case of Latin America, a half continent, you would see absolutely no infrastructure. If there was a little bit of infrastructure, it would go from the natural resources to the port, and then, absolutely stop at the place where the minerals or other things were being exploited. But, it was just for colonial exploitation and never for the development of the interior of the continent. And this is now changing. I mean, what China is now doing also in Latin America, as in Africa, is exactly the kinds of development plans being realized, what was already talked about by Alexander von Humboldt, and naturally my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who after all worked with Lopez Portillo in the beginning of the 80s on exactly such a development plan, which we called Operation Juarez at the time, which was the idea that the entire Latin American continent, which most countries speak Spanish except Brazil speaking Portuguese, but this is in a certain way much easier to integrate than the European continent, which has so many different nations and languages and cultures. So what China is now doing is practically the implementation of the kinds of plans which we had pushed at the beginning of the 80s. And this is a very good development. There are many countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, which are completely on board. And, it's a very good development because, the Chinese model of economic transformation, of turning poor countries into countries where people have a future and also a future orientation in advanced areas like joint space exploration, space research. I mean, this is a very positive development, and I think it is the leading dynamic in the world, and nothing will derail that except if some people cause nuclear war. But short of that, I don't think anything will stop this.
And Helga, as you've called for, if the Chinese can raise living standards, raise 800 million people out of poverty in China, and now are doing the same thing in Africa and South America, why can't we do that in Europe and the United States?
Yes, at our last recent Schiller Institute conference in Frankfurt, we made a resolution and called on the European nations to do likewise what the Chinese are doing, who have, China has now officially said, also this was mentioned by Louis He at the Davos conference, that China has only 30 million poor people left, while Europe has 90 million. But nevertheless, why cannot Europe say, like China, that the poverty is being eradicated until 2020? And obviously for the United States, that should be done as well. Why should we live with a condition, which you have in Germany, I think 45 individuals own as much wealth than half of the population. I think 8 people in the world own as much as half of the world population. I mean, this is just totally crazy. Nobody can use that much money. It just is completely unjust, and it should not be like that. I think we have to have the commitment to have a decent living standard for all human beings on this planet. And this is not just a question of justice. This is also the question that the human potential, which is being wasted when people are hungry, when people, cannot develop their creative potential because they are poor and they have to run for their livelihood with 3 jobs a day or other conditions. I mean, the human potential, which can be developed once everybody has a decent living standard, have to have an idea that we need a new paradigm of a completely different thinking. I mean, what is the meaning of life? Is it to eat 5 tons of caviar in your lifespan and have 20 Porsches and 5 yachts and 3 jets? Obviously not. Obviously, it is much more sensible to have a meaningful life, being a scientist, being an artist, being a good teacher, have the fulfillment of your life by contributing to the continued development of mankind as a whole with whatever potential you have, whatever share you can contribute. And I think we need a rethinking. I think this mindless thought that money is controlling the world and that money is what makes you happy has to be replaced by other ideas, like the Leibnizian idea of the pursuit of happiness, which is in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. And Leibniz did not mean making a lot of money. What Leibniz meant with happiness was the idea that the creative potential of each person has to be guaranteed and must be realized. And I think with the new paradigm pushed with the Belt and Road Initiative, and Xi Jinping has said many, many times that this is not just infrastructure, but there is a cultural dimension to the Silk Road and a space dimension to the Silk Road. And this all pertains to the creative potential of the human beings. And I think people have to start to discuss that. You know, we need to have a political discourse of where should the future of humanity be in 50 years or in 100 years from now. And do we not want to become adult as a species where, you know, people treasure other things than just, material things? I think people should think, you know, that we are at the crossroad where if we do our job right now and bring the United States and the European nations in collaboration with the new Silk Road, that we can have a completely new era of civilization, probably in our lifetime. And that is something I would appeal to our listeners, to you, to just contact us, join us, help our efforts, and make what we are saying more known.
And as you said so beautifully, that's what will make people happy, being able to do that. So Helga, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.
Yes, till next week.